As many of you sensed yesterday, a tension that exists in the 17th century between, on the one hand, Bacon's call for an inductive, empirical new approach to knowledge, and Descartes' call for the application of reason and rational understanding. And when we turn now to John Locke's theory of knowledge, it's perhaps time to address that tension a bit more explicitly. The normal distinction that the textbooks make between the two major strains of anti-Aristotelian thought in the 17th century are between, on the one hand, rationalism, the belief that reason alone, unaided by the deceptive errant senses, can give us knowledge of truth about the world in which we find ourselves, rationalism, as it is termed, and empiricism, the belief that reason flies on its own to order, to imaginary spider webs, constructions of reality, and in Bacon's phrase, needs to be weighted down by the experience of the senses and proceed inductively from the things of nature themselves. When the textbooks address this, they usually oppose, on the one hand, René Descartes as the archetypical rationalist and John Locke as the archetypical empiricist. And though the distinction is, in fact, a very useful one, it is a distinction that can be overdrawn, and in talking about that, perhaps we can see some of the nuances as well as the broad brushstrokes of 17th century thought. First, let's realize to what an extent René Descartes is an empiricist as well as being a rationalist. Recall that once through reason, he determines that what is out there, what we sense as a material world, what is out there, we know through mind to be extension in length, width, and depth, in motion, according to fixed mechanical laws, all of which he arrives at purely by reason. Right? It is his deduction from the immutability of God's will that leads Descartes to say there will be fixed immutable laws of motion, for God setting matter into motion doesn't change his will, doesn't change his mind. But once Descartes reaches that point in his philosophy, he must become an empiricist. For reason cannot tell you what those laws of motion are. Reason can't tell you what the laws of mechanics are. And at that moment, Locke's rationalism, I said it again, forgive me, Descartes' rationalism leads him to insist that we become empirical, open our eyes, study the world of matter in motion. And Cartesian physicists and physiologists set about to dissect bodies, to study the motion of muscles, to study the central nervous system, to engage in experiment with matter in motion, to count, to weigh, to measure. On the other hand, Descartes' rationalism takes him very far. For example, even in his physics, he posits without a single experiment the law of inertia, that matter in motion remains at motion in a uniformly straight line. Matter at rest remains at rest unless acted upon by another force. He deduces that from the fixed will of God. He also deduces as a precondition for all physics, and it's a dramatic claim of reason over empirical observation, that we know by reason that there can be no vacuum, that it is a self-contradiction to say that nothing occupies space. So Descartes and all Cartesians reject as a logical absurdity the concept of the vacuum. And they are convinced that all physics can be understood as fluid dynamics, that in the same way that we don't see air, though it's matter there, that in what people think of as a vacuum, there must be a very rare matter, a very diffuse matter. And all physics for Descartes is matter touching matter, as in a great tub in which you had ice and water and steam, matter in different forms, but all a problem of fluid dynamics. For a true empiricist to make such assumptions, there can be no vacuum. We know that by reason. The law of inertia must be prior to investigation. Are excessive claims of reason and logic over observation of the physical world. But it is important to understand the large domain given to empiricism in the Cartesian framework, that bound by what reason knows, at some point we open our eyes, we weigh, we measure, we explore the mechanical, physical universe. Likewise, one can overdraw the case for Locke's empiricism. For Locke also is very much, when he thinks on the issue of truth, a rationalist. John Locke wants to distinguish categorically between two kinds of propositions the human mind can make about reality. One would be, there are 45 people in this room. That's an empirical proposition. The only way to confirm it or disconfirm it is to count, and there's always the chance you could be wrong. You could miscount, you could count someone twice, someone could be cleverly hiding, and you would miss the person. But Locke notes there's another kind of proposition we make, that 45 people in a room are more people than 40 people in a room. That an empty room and a room filled with people are not the same. For Locke, these are propositions we may know with certainty, that a circle is not a triangle, that 3 is more than 2. And he believes with Descartes that the mind knows the truth of those kinds of propositions, the relationship of ideas, how a triangle compares to a square at a level of logical analysis, how 3 is more than 2 at the level of logical analysis. Locke agrees with Descartes when he talks about certainty, about truth, that those kinds of propositions the mind is compelled to see as true as soon as it turns its gaze at such propositions. He says their truth is a bright sunshine in the mind. We know them with intuitive certainty. If someone said to you, I've just seen 3 people and it's fewer people than 2 people, you don't say, let's go out and look. You say, you're wrong. 3 is more than 2. And Locke calls that intuitive truth. And we only have certainty at the level of intuitive truth. But what is critical for Locke about that kind of truth is while it does tell us true or false things about the comparison of the ideas that we have, it does not tell us anything about the phenomena of the world, about the behavior of things in the world that we experience. And the real division between Cartesian rationalism on the one hand and Lockean empiricism on the other can be seen in two great questions above all. One, what is the goal of fundamental natural philosophy? For Descartes, as we've seen, that goal is that we should have true knowledge about the real qualities of the world, what things are in and of themselves. For Locke, the goal of fundamental natural philosophy in the final analysis is knowledge of our experience of the world. A second great difference is the question of what are these ideas we have in our mind and where do they come from? What is the source of the way we think about the world? And what follows from identifying that source correctly? For Descartes, we have innate ideas. We are born with ideas in our soul. God has imprinted upon the human mind ideas of self, of matter, of soul, of God himself. That is the source of our ideas. For John Locke, all ideas are derived from our experience of the world in which we find ourselves. Thus, if for Locke the issue is where do we find certain rational truth, he sounds Cartesian. The criterion is intuitive certainty and issues of identity, that something is either A or not A, that if something is a circle, it cannot be a square, or ideas of relationship, that 3 is greater than 2. These are intuitively known as certain. But these rational, intuitively certain truths do not give us knowledge of the world in which we find ourselves. That knowledge is known only by acquired ideas. We only know, because all of our ideas arise from our experience, we only know phenomena, the appearance of things in human experience. For Locke, this is not a pessimistic retreat in terms of the claims of philosophy. There is a sense of divine providence and divine providential optimism that pervades John Locke's philosophy. We have, as our mental capacities, what God intended us to have to suit our needs. God adapted our mental powers to being successfully human in the natural world that we experience. And we can be successfully human if we know how to make proper use of the mental faculties with which we have been endowed by God. For John Locke, all of our ideas are acquired by experience. Now, in the course of the 18th century, people increasingly will define experience and present themselves as Lockeans as solely the experience of the senses. But John Locke himself argues that we have two sources of experience, two windows, if you will, through which ideas experiences occur and ideas are formed in the mind. First is the experiences of sensation, our sense experiences. The things of the world strike our five senses, and those sensations are received in the mind and transformed into ideas of the things experienced. But we have for Locke a second source of experience as well that Locke labels reflection. And that is the experience we have of our minds dealing with the ideas of sensation. Thus, without sensation, nothing would happen in the mind. But with sense impressions in the mind, we find ourselves having mental experiences, thinking, comparing, judging. We are aware of the behavior of our minds doing those things. And by reflection upon the operation of our minds, we have another source of ideas of experience. Ideas of reflection, our ideas of what it is that our mind does. All human thought, all ideas, all knowledge, for John Locke, can be traced only to these two sources: sensations and reflections. For Locke, in the manner of atoms forming into molecules, simple sensations or reflections combine in the mind to form complex ideas. For example, having the idea of this street and that street, these buildings and those buildings, I can form the idea by combining them of the city or of Washington, D.C. It's not that I have a direct perception of the city or of a particular city, but that the mind is capable of combining the units of its experience and giving a name to the larger entity thus formed, in this case, the city. What this means, in direct contrast to Descartes, is that there are no innate ideas. All ideas are acquired by experience, from which follows one of the most dramatic possible claims in the history of theories of knowledge: that our knowledge is absolutely limited to our experience of the world. Where there is not experience, there is not knowledge. All human knowledge is acquired, is learned, and is ultimately dependent upon human experience. Now, if one thinks of the sorts of issues that so obsessed the Aristotelian scholastics, and Descartes when he thought about the essence of matter and soul, and Galileo when he tried to distinguish between primary qualities, what is really out there, and secondary qualities, what do we experience of what is out there. If we think of those obsessive concerns of Western philosophy, what is substance? What's real out there? What is it out there that causes human experience, or that exists apart from human experience? John Locke makes a dramatic answer, and to the extent that it is accepted, the whole enterprise of Western philosophy is altered. Locke's answer is that if knowledge is bounded by experience, we have no knowledge of what underlies experience. We cannot know what is real in a sense of prior to or underlying the phenomena of human experience. We have no non-experiential, rational source of knowledge of mind and matter. Where Descartes, Galileo, the scholastics would say mind really is, or matter really is, this, its substantial form in scholasticism. The clear and distinct idea we have of it in Descartes, primary qualities in Galileo. Locke says we need to distinguish between the nominal essence of something, the name that we give a set of experiences to distinguish it from another, and the real essence, what it is apart from our experience, and understand that all we know is nominal essence. We cannot know the real essence of something. So we look at the material world and we say, what I mean by a body, a material body, is something extended in length, width, and depth. We don't know if that's what's real. We don't know if there were minds other than human minds, experiences other than human experiences. What in fact it is that we experience as a body. What we do is we say, I will take these features in my experience of the world, length, width, and breadth, and say it is that element of my experience of the phenomena to which I am referring when I use the word body. Similarly, and in many ways much more dramatically for Locke, we do not know what mind is for the same reasons. We can't experience what underlies the phenomena of mind. We only experience the phenomena of mind, the behavior of mind. And our knowledge, for better or worse, is limited to that. The scholastics want to say that mind is a specific, substantial form of rational, immaterial, incorporeal soul. Descartes wants to say that mind is thought, spirit, immaterial, incorruptible, eternal. Locke wants to say we don't know what mind is. We experience the phenomena of mind. As you can imagine, there are those who want to charge him with great impiety here. But listen to how successfully he defends himself theologically. His critics say, then we have no proof of the immortality of the soul, the spirituality of mind? You're saying that for all we know, matter could think that experiencing the behavior of mind, we don't have to posit an immaterial, incorporeal soul? And Locke replies, are you saying that God, in his infinite omnipotence, could not, if he so wished, endow matter with the capacity for thought? Are you saying that God could not create thinking matter? And he charges blasphemy, in effect, to his critics who would charge it to him. Now, in fact, Locke leans toward a certain dualism. It's clear from his writings that he thinks it most likely that there are two different things about which we can't know anything, one material and one spiritual. But we cannot know what underlies experience, and we need to admit our ignorance. In the 1730s, popularizing Locke for a French audience in his philosophical letters from England, Voltaire, who will be the most influential author of the 18th century in Europe, writes that until Locke, all philosophers had created novels, romances, fantasies about the soul, that there were 100 theories of what the soul was, and that Locke has been the first to say, we don't know, we can't know, but we can study how mind proceeds. For Locke and for Voltaire, this was proper humility. If knowledge was bound by experience, then on a large number of what had been the major philosophical questions in the history of Western philosophy, the appropriate answer of an honest mind was, I do not know. I cannot know. My knowledge is bound by human experience, which does not take me there. The problem, then, is not to know what mind is, but how in experience mind behaves. Not to know what matter is, but to know in experience how the physical world behaves. Since such knowledge is not based upon logic, the comparison of 3 and 2, for example, but upon experience, such knowledge is always open to correction by further experience. We may not, given the limitations of human knowledge, arrive at certainty, because we never know what the next set of experiences will be. The first 1,000 people you meet on an island might have red hair. If you're a betting person, bet that the 1,001st will have red hair. It is highly probable, but there is no logical necessity. And indeed, if someone with brown hair comes along, you'll change your proposition. Most people on this island have red hair. Someone raised in the tropics, hearing that someone had walked across a lake, would find that absolutely inconceivable, impossible. But look how the person can't know that with certainty. The first time brought out of a tropical clime and seeing ice, a frozen lake, the person from the tropics must add new experience to his knowledge of the world and change an understanding of the nature of the world in which we find ourselves. The mind, for Locke, is what he terms a tabula rasa, a blank slate, on which nature imprints ideas via sensations, and in which the mind becomes aware of its own operations on sensations via reflection. Some ideas, as if almost by gravity, attract each other. They associate. But the mind, above all, is active. And by abstraction, looking for common denominators in ideas from experience, and by combination, it forms complex ideas. Examining individual human beings, I abstract what they have in common and derive my notion of humanity or human nature. Examining my experience of visual perception, I abstract the idea of color. Traveling, reading, and amassing my experience of the different peoples on a continent, I combine notions and frame my idea of Europeans. And the propositions that I make about those ideas, those experiences, to the extent that they are not purely logical comparisons, that they purport to describe how the world behaves, can only be probable, never certain, and depend for their degree of probability upon their relationship to experience. One of the things that leads Europe to embrace Lockean epistemology, or theory of knowledge. Epistemology means a theory of knowledge. One of the things that leads Europe to embrace Lockean epistemology with such fervor that for 100 years, almost all leading European thinkers will describe themselves in one way or another as Lockeans, is the belief that Locke's model both builds upon Bacon and the invitation to a new inductive science and accounts for, explains, and gives us the model for the progress of the experimental sciences. Gilbert on magnetism, Harvey on the circulation of blood, Huygens on the pendulum and centrifugal force, Boyle on the expansion of gases, Galileo, and eventually Newton. The culture believes that the Lockean epistemology is in fact an explanation of and the proper model for what is working in the experimental sciences, and that it is the heir to Bacon's invitation for a new science. As this model becomes the common property of European thinkers, what features of it are most important for the transformation of European culture? Note that it is a model that demands always and leads to a demand for analysis, for clarity, and for confirmation. In theory, any proposition, however complex, however abstract it sounds, if it is an authentic proposition of knowledge, can be analyzed, can be broken down into its component ideas. Those component ideas can be analyzed and broken down to the experiences that someone has claimed to have, on the basis of which one purports to know something about the world. Any proposition, then, may be analyzed ultimately into a claim about human experience and then judged and evaluated on the basis of its relationship to actual experience. The world of learning, the world of deep knowledge, the world of deep claims, of unraveling the secrets of the universe and the reality in which we find ourselves, now becomes, by Lockean analysis and experimental confirmation, a lucid world, a demystified world of knowledge, and accessible world, devoid of any irreducible obscurity. Take the most complex claim anyone makes, and you have the right to say what are its simple parts from which it is built, what ideas inform it, and what experiences led to those ideas and led to the claims, and can we confirm them against further experience. It leads to an impulse, very subversive in a world of intellectual authority. It leads to an impulse to ask again and again, what gives you the right to make that claim? What is the source of your alleged knowledge? How do you know that? And it invites an intellectual culture to undertake the empirical confirmation or disconfirmation of all the propositions people would make about the world by comparison to the claims of teachers, thinkers, philosophers, to the behavior of the things described. This becomes, in many ways, the mission of the 18th century, to analyze all prior claims of knowledge, and above all, to do so on the basis of open, communicable human experience. For Locke, and it is a side of his work that he sees as very providential and reinforcing of the awe we ought to have at the universe God has given us, but for others it seems profoundly subversive in its implications. For Locke, we also learn our ethical ideas by experience also. There are no inborn ethical principles, ideas of good and evil. And Locke seeks to analyze how we come to form ideas of good and evil. The analysis he makes is that we call good those things that cause, or that we believe will cause, human well-being and happiness. We call evil what causes or what we believe will cause pain. For people who accept this model, when we realize that something will lead to human harm, to wars, to pain, to suffering, we attach the term good. Excuse me, we attach the term evil. And when we believe that something will lead to human well-being, ease of pain, harmony, prosperity, we attach the term good. For Locke, what makes this model justifiable in a theological sense is his belief that God has so arranged the world that those things that are the real objective sources of human well-being are those things which God himself has willed as the good. That if we truly pay close, empirical, rigorous attention to the real causes of human well-being or human misery, we shall reach those ideas of good and evil, vice and virtue, that God himself has willed. Now, if one holds to Locke's model of learned ethical ideas, and to a sense that just as God has given us faculties adapted to our needs, we don't have to know what a river really is. We have to know how it behaves. We don't have to know what crops really are at a level of metaphysics. We need to know how they grow, how they behave, the circumstances in which we interact with them. In that same way, for Locke, God has providentially adapted ethics to the ways in which human beings actually experience. And for Lockeans, for example, it is not accidental. It is not accidental that the religions of the world and the true Judeo-Christian, or for Locke's culture, the true Christian religion, should speak of notions of eternal reward, eternal bliss, eternal happiness, or eternal pain, eternal suffering, eternal damnation. Because it is precisely by understanding the consequences for well-being or for misery that we learn our ethical ideas. And note that if one thinks of that system as governed by providential design, God's design, what an extraordinarily optimistic scenario it is. We seek happiness. We seek to avoid pain. But we make errors. We have false ideas, false propositions about what would really make us happy, what would really make us miserable. But in the same way that if we attend empirically to nature, if we use our senses and mind properly, we can master medicine, we can master crop growth, we can deal with the physical events of the world. Similarly, if we use our minds properly, we can seek the true and real causes of human well-being or human misery, and in doing such, reach appropriate ideas of good and evil. But without such a providential model, then Locke's analysis of the acquisition of ethical ideas can be subversive indeed. For it could be read as saying, all we mean by the good is that which we believe will make us happy. All we mean by evil is that which we believe will cause us pain. For Locke, it is an optimistic, providential, fully religious mode of analyzing the acquisition of ideas of good and evil. But it plants a very subversive seed about the meaning of ethical terms. How, given Locke's sense that we learn all things from experience, is it possible to reach mysterious knowledge about God and religion? For Locke, there is no problem here, for God adapts all things to human senses. God has revealed to us and has shown us that something is from God in the New Testament. Namely, the ministry of Christ was accompanied by the performance of miracles and the fulfillment of prophecy. People who had nothing to gain, the apostles, everything to lose, martyrdom and suffering, said, we saw him raised from the dead, we saw he himself be resurrected after 3 days of death, we saw him walk on the waters, bring food down from the heavens. For Locke, this is God's empirical seal of evidence upon the New Testament. And at that point, knowing that the source is God, it makes good scientific sense. It is utterly reasonable to believe the content of Scripture. And Locke entitles his major work of religious apologetics, The Reasonableness of Christianity. The analogy is simple. If you walked out one day and the clouds had formed themselves into a pattern above your house that said, John, you're wrong. I exist. God. You might think you were deluded, but you check and everyone has seen it. You check if there were skyriders up. Nope, and there's no diffusion of the clouds. You now know this is the real thing. Would you or would you not pay close attention to anything urged upon you in the next message in those clouds? For Locke, God put his empirical stamp of evidence upon the New Testament, the fulfillment of prophecy, the accomplishment of miracles, attested to, Locke believes, by credible witnesses. That teaches us that Scripture is from God on good, scientific, empirical, reasonable grounds. And thus, it is sane and reasonable to believe the content of Scripture. For many, Locke had made the world of knowledge, the world of philosophy, the world of science, the world of religion clearer than they had ever been. And it is a model that exercises a very powerful attraction upon European civilization for the next 100 years. Thank you.